So my dad's birthday is in just a couple of weeks, and I have made a quilt for my parents and for my mom, but never for my dad. And so I think his birthday is the day. So when I was a kid, my parents had this amazing 70s acrylic crocheted ripple afghan. And it has finally been lost to the years, but I've decided that it was time for a little remake, a little rebirth of that crocheted afghan. And this is the design that I've come up with. I wanted to use some 70s colors, so I have this kind of celery green and kind of the golds. And it's time to make a new ripple quilt for my dad. The cutting instructions for this quilt could not be easier. You're going to be making 9" by width of fabric slices into your yardage, and then subcutting those into 9" squares. For almost all of the colors, you're going to need 8 9" squares, which fits perfectly into a ½ yard of fabric. The other 2 colors, you're going to need just 4 9" squares. So you could get a ¼ yard of fabric, but be careful when you're buying yardage that is so close to the requirements that are needed in any pattern, because if your local shop or the factory cutting the fabric cuts it at a little bit of an angle, you might run up a little bit short. So you can always buy a little bit more, like 2/3 of a yard, and use the extra for binding. So after you have all of your squares cut, you are going to shuffle them into combinations that will help you achieve this nice kind of gradient look. Now the instructions are all here, and I just followed them, and now I have my final 2 pairings, this 4 squares of 5 and F. So we have made a lot of half square triangles on this channel, and this set is no different. Now these are large half square triangles, and I've chosen to do them 2 at a time because they are so large. If we wanted to do 8 at a time, we would need squares that are 4 times as big. And that's just a little bit too big to kind of comfortably deal with at my sewing machine or on my little cutting table. You could certainly do it. If you choose to do that, you will need to cut squares that are 18 inches by 18 inches. So I'm gonna grab my pen. I'm using a friction pen, which does disappear with heat, but I still wouldn't mark on the surface of my quilt or in a place that's going to be visible once your quilt is finished. I'm going to be marking lines that will be used later as cutting lines, so I'm not concerned if it doesn't completely disappear. I'm going to draw a line on the diagonal of these big blocks. Now I am marking on the light colored square just so my marks show up a little bit better, but you can mark on whichever side, whichever pair of your fabrics you desire. It doesn't matter. Now when I'm marking, especially on a large square like this, I always start in the center and go out so that I'm not dragging that tip down and kind of ending up with a wonky line. If you start in the center and go out to the tips, then you'll have a nice crisp line to follow. Once your lines are drawn, you're gonna align 2 of your squares right sides together. I'm using solids, so it doesn't matter, but if you're using prints, make sure they're right sides together. And now I'm gonna sew a 1/4 inch on either side of this line. Now you certainly can chain piece these squares together, but I find that working with that little tip on the tip of the square makes it a little bit hard, so I just do 1 at a time, especially with these big squares. So now that I have those 2 seam lines sewn, I'm going to cut on the diagonal. Be sure to do this before you press anything or your line will disappear if you're using a friction pen. Ooh, that blade needs replacing. I have my 2 half square triangles all ready to press. So I am going to repeat this process 3 more times with the 3 squares of each color I have left. And that will give me 8 half square triangles, which is 1 complete row of this quilt. So I'm gonna do this and then we can trim them up. So I'm trimming my very last half square triangle here. Now, if you just do not want to deal with this step, then you can, instead of cutting 9" squares, you can cut 8 7/8 inch squares. And The math works out so that you will end up with 8.5-inch square half square triangles after sewing and pressing them open. But I don't know. I never do that. I've never managed to sew a perfect 2 at a time half square triangle. So I always trim. But if you are extra accurate, you can cut 8 7/8. Now that I have all of my half square triangles trimmed up and perfect, it's time to assemble our rows. Now be sure to refer to the little diagram in the quilt pattern here, because each row has a different orientation of your blocks. So I've been checking them off as I've been making them here, and now it's time for this final row. I want this first half square triangle in this row to have the light side up to the left. On the next one, the light side goes down and to the right. Now this row has 8 half square triangles, and they do kind of repeat in this pattern of this dark stripe kind of going in the center. It's half of the chevron that we'll eventually create. So I'm gonna go ahead and lay this orientation out 4 times. So this just sets me up to chain piece this a little bit. I can sew this seam between all of these blocks, and then I'll be ready to finish assembly of the row. I've sewn all of my pairs together, and I went ahead and pressed my seam allowances open. Now that's just my preference. If you prefer to press to the side, that's fine. I do press as I assemble rather than assembling the entire row. It's just a personal preference. I kind of like to have a smaller piece of fabric to finagle when I'm pressing, but you can obviously wait until the end to press all of these seams since none of them intersect, but do as you wish. Now that I have all 4 pairs sewn together, I can sew the pairs together into 4 half square triangle units. And I'll have 2 of those. And once I finish with these, I'm going to go ahead and sew the 2 4-piece segments into one long 8-piece row. And then we can talk about some tips for row assembly. So I have finished my whole row, and now it is time to add it to the rest of my quilt top. So I have them right sides together here. I kind of laid it out and make sure it was oriented right. But on this quilt, a tip for aligning these rows is that you should always be sewing like color to like color. They may be the same shade as they are in this green, or they may be kind of one shade off, like these yellows are a little bit different, but they're both yellow. I'm not sewing a green to a yellow at any point. And that's what will help maintain this kind of ombre chevron look. So let's talk about pinning and not losing our nice little half square triangle points. This is a fairly simple quilt pattern, and so maintaining your points is kind of the oomph of this quilt, is having nice, precise kind of color arrangement and piecing. So I'm going to show you how I pin when I am pinning my points. Now this is a little bit easier if you press your seams open. It's not impossible if you press to the side, but you might have to kind of open it up a little bit and find these points. So the point that I'm talking about is in this seam, this point right here is the opposite side of the point on the inside, the point that is on the right side of the fabric. So if we stick a pin right there, it will come out and show on the right side of the fabric. Now, if we take this and we take that same pin and we stick it through the intersection on the other row that we're sewing together, we now have those points kind of tied together. They are aligned. You can see this pin is going through both of them. So that helps us align them. So now what I want to do is grab another pin and pin just right next to that pin that is holding them together. You can pin in whatever orientation is your preference. I pin kind of down the seam a little bit, parallel to the seam. So what I have seen other people do is the same kind of method where they will align the pins and get that fabric all kind of nested up together, and then they will take that same pin and just rotate it and stick it in. Now here's why I don't do that. Let's say this is your pin and these are your points. You have the pin aligning those points, and then you bend the pin and kind of stick it back through. Look what that does to the layers of fabric when you bend that pin. They are shifting. As you bend that pin, you're shifting those layers just slightly. Now, it is a couple of threads, it's barely anything, but when you open that seam back up, a couple of threads on a simple quilt like this is going to make those points not quite match. So just grab another pin, and then I will take that pin and I will use it to mark the next one. Now I will go all the way down the row doing this until I get to the very end. And those are the only pins that I put in a row like this because there are so few points. I kind of want a little bit of extra fabric between these spaces. This is about as far as I would go. If this was any bigger, I'd probably put a pin in the middle. But I do want enough fabric between these so that I can kind of give a little tug to one or kind of ease in any extra fabric that's on one layer so that my points come together really nicely. Now, I am not paying attention that much to where this point falls on my seam allowance. So on this point I cut it a little bit close, and that point, this distance from my pin to the edge of this fabric is not 1/4 of an inch. But I'm more concerned about where the point is rather than the distance there, because no one's going to go back and measure your seam allowances once your quilt is done. As long as they are over 1/8 of an inch or so, as long as they're structurally stable, I care more about how it looks on the front of the quilt than my seam allowance is matching. So this one is a little bit more than 1/4 of an inch, but that's okay. I'm sticking that pin through the points. See how mismatched those are? But once I sew them and I hit those points, no one will ever know. So I have all of my pins in. Now I'm going to sew. And when I sew, I am going to make sure that as I approach these intersections where I can see those little triangles of the points of the half square triangle, I'm going to sew just a thread width away from them. And I want to vary my seam allowance however much is necessary so that I hit those points. And that will ensure that my points match on the right side. Okay, I've sewn my long seam. Let's see how my points look. Now, I really like this method, but it is not foolproof. Sometimes you do have some points that aren't perfect. These all look pretty good so far. So I do kind of open up my seam and kind of take a look at it before I press, because secret, I seam rip a lot. All of my points here look pretty good, but if I did have a point that wasn't to my liking, like, we could do a little bit better on this one. So I'll show you how I fix it. I'm not going to rip out this whole seam. All I need to do is fix this one point. So that's all I'm going to rip. I'm going to take my seam ripper and I'm just going to get through a couple of stitches around that seam. Right now, I just want to do enough to kind of get my seam ripper in there. So I do a couple of inches to the left, and I'll do a couple of inches to the right. And this is all I'm going to open up, because that's all the fabric I need to kind of ease this point into place. So I am going to repin this and re-sew that section. And if you feel like you want to backstitch a little bit, kind of as your threads cross each other, then you can certainly do that. I'm going to stitch from about here to about here. I don't bother to backstitch because I am overlapping a pretty good amount. Here is my repaired seam. You can see I overlapped my stitching for about 1 inch or 2 on either side. And I don't know, that looks pretty good. So I seam rip like this all the time, and I also have a few other tricks for sewing accuracy when I'm doing seams that are a little bit longer. If this point was like the point that I wanted to hit on a long seam, then I would start in the middle and I would sew from about here that way, and then I would come back and check my point. And if it was good, then I would sew from about here all the way to the end that way. I'm not going to start at the end and kind of get all the way here before I know if that point is going to be perfect. If this is the most important point, then it's where I'm going to start sewing. I also baste points. I don't see a lot of other quilters basting seams, but I do it all the time. If there's a really important seam in a quilt, or in a block, then I will baste it and make sure that those points are held together by stitches and they are perfect before I put in all my little teeny tiny stitches. So I'll crank up my machine to like 6, however high it goes, for those nice long basting stitches, and I will baste a seam, open it up, make sure I'm in love with it, and then I will re-sew it. I don't rip the basting stitches out, I just sew over them with my tiny secure stitches. And then I know that seam is going to be perfect. So now that I know my top is all perfect and done, it's time to quilt it. Now this quilt is for my dad, and I have the perfect pantograph picked out because I spent about 1 million hours folding paper airplanes with my dad when I was a kid. And so I found a paper airplane pantograph, and even though I don't think it really matches the quilt, it matches me and him. So that's what's going on this. But I do have a miniature version of this quilt top to show you some free motion quilting on the domestic machine. I decided to shake up my color scheme for my mini version of this quilt for my domestic quilting, and made my kind of double chevron ombre in pinks and purples this time. I grabbed my walking foot and decided to do some echo quilting of the chevron in the purple chevrons, and I just followed the seam line between the red and purple areas with the edge of my foot. I'm guessing it's probably about 1/4 of an inch, but I didn't measure since the edge of your foot is just such a convenient place to kind of line things up. I pivoted at the seam lines so that I knew that I would be kind of the same distance away from the kind of red-purple boundary on both sides of the chevron. I repeated the walking foot technique on both sides of the purple chevrons, and then I swapped out my walking foot for my free motion quilting foot and had some fun in the pink areas. For the free motion quilting in the kind of red pink areas, I knew that I wanted something with some curves and a little bit of movement since there are so many straight lines in this quilt. I ended up doing a little kind of 3-petal shape in each of the kind of inner corners of the chevrons. I had a little petal, kind of a big petal that went almost all the way across the chevron, and then another smaller petal. I made sure to leave myself a little bit of room to escape and made kind of a nice elongated S shape that curved around my little 3-petal shape down into kind of the next right angle bottom of the chevron. I really like this design since it does look good kind of right side up and upside down, so no matter which way the pillow ends up on the couch, or if you're doing this kind of design on a quilt, there's no kind of it has to be held one way for it to kind of look correct. I really do prefer designs that have no proper upside or downside. This was a pretty quick little pattern to do, and if you are interested in getting into feathers or kind of a little bit more complex free motion quilting, this would be a really nice shape to kind of work on since you are making that kind of elongated curve and then returning back to kind of your starting point. So I'd recommend this design if you are looking to expand your kind of free motion quilting repertoire. Once I finished with the full rows of pink, I was left with these little kind of awkward half sides to contend with, and I just kind of faked the design. I started with kind of half of a large petal and 1 small petal, and then just kind of let that S shape fall off the edge, and then I just traveled down the side and picked back up with the other end of what would have been the next kind of elongated S, and did a full repeat of my little 3-petal shape thing, and repeated that, just kind of filling in the design. You could choose an alternate design to fill in these edges, but with such a kind of small pillow, I didn't want to cram too many different designs on it, so I just repeated the shape and went along with the kind of pillow making journey. So it's a few days later and my quilt is all finished and bound and ready. I'm actually packaging it up in just a few minutes to take down to my dad. I'm really pleased with how this came together. I think it really captures that kind of ripple afghan feel that I was going for, and while the colors are my normal palette, I really do like how they went together. I love kind of that double ombre effect that this pattern gives. I did have a real issue with this quilt. I finished the quilting, I brought it upstairs, and I went to set it down on my cutting table to trim it, and it caught on the edge of one of my shelves and ripped a hole in the back. I tried to repair it with some thread, but I just really wasn't happy with it, so I did end up putting a label over that spot, even though it was kind of in the center of the side. But it seems like that was the best way to deal with it, so I'm happy with that as a solution, even if it's a little awkward. I also finished the pillow that you guys saw me quilt, and I think this is really adorable. Usually I use the backing that I used on the quilt for the matching pillow, but in this case the pillow didn't really match, and I'm not keeping them together as a set anyway, so I decided to take advantage and use this little chipper fabric from Tula Pink, since the pinks and purples matched so nicely. So that's it for the 70s quilt. I hope you guys enjoyed this as much as I do, and I hope my dad enjoys it once I give it to him. But I will be back soon with another video. In the meantime, there are more quilting videos popping up on the screen, and I hope you guys have a lovely couple weeks. Happy quilting!